Jake Morrison had worked with engines for 25 years, and his hands showed every moment of it. The scars and calluses told stories of burned fingers and slipped wrenches and long nights in cold cargo bays. He was 45 years old and tired in a way that sleep could not fix. When the message came through the subspace relay, he almost deleted it, thinking it was another scam. The message was from a lawyer on Threshold Station. His Uncle Danny had died and left him something. Jake had not seen Uncle Danny in 15 years. The old man had disappeared into the outer territories, chasing some dream about freedom and adventure. Now he was gone, and Jake was apparently his only living relative. The inheritance was a bar called Rusty Comet. Jake stared at the legal documents for a long time. He'd been thinking about retirement anyway. The shipping company he worked for was downsizing, and mechanics his age were expensive compared to the young kids fresh out of technical school. A bar on a forgotten station at the edge of nowhere sounded insane. It also sounded like exactly the kind of change he needed. He packed his tools and took a transport to Threshold Station. The station was old. It's not charming old or vintage old, but genuinely falling apart old. The docking ports wheezed when they sealed. The gravity generators hummed with a sound that meant they needed maintenance 3 years ago. The corridors smelled like recycled air that had been recycled too many times. This was a place where 3 different government territories met, and none of them cared enough to actually govern it. The Rusty Comet was in the lower commercial ring. Jake found it wedged between a pawn shop that looked abandoned and a noodle stand that smelled questionable. The door was stuck, and he had to kick it twice to get it open. Inside was worse than he imagined. The floor was sticky with decades of spilled drinks. The lights flickered in a pattern that suggested faulty wiring. The furniture looked like it had survived a small war and lost. Behind the bar were shelves of bottles covered in dust. Some of the labels were in languages Jake did not recognize. The whole place smelled like old beer and broken dreams. Jake set down his tool bag and looked around. This was his now. It's a disaster of a bar in the middle of nowhere. He should have felt depressed, but instead he felt something like excitement. This was a problem he could fix. Problems were what he understood. He spent the first day cleaning. The second day he replaced the air recyclers because the old ones were pumping out more noise than fresh air. The third day he fixed the lights and discovered that half the wiring in the place was held together with tape and hope. By the fourth day the bar almost looked respectable. That was when she walked in. Jake was under the counter fixing a coolant leak when he heard the door chime. He stood up too fast and hit his head on the underside of the bar. When he stopped seeing stars, he saw her standing in the doorway. She was tall and moved like water flowing uphill. Her hair was silver and seemed to catch light that was not actually there. Her ears came to elegant points that swept back from her head. Her face was beautiful in a way that made Jake forget how to breathe, but it was her eyes that held him frozen. They were violet and deep and looked like they had seen things that would break a normal person. She wore armor that looked organic, like it had been grown instead of made. At her side hung a sword that hummed with energy Jake could feel from across the room. Around her shoulders was coiled what Jake had first thought was a decorative scarf. Then it moved, and he saw scales that shifted through colors and tiny horns, and eyes that gleamed with intelligence. That was a dragon. A small dragon, but definitely a dragon. Jake tried to remember how to speak. The woman walked to the bar with steps that made no sound. She looked at him and he felt like an insect being examined by something vast and ancient. The woman spoke, and her voice had layers to it like multiple sounds happening at once. She said she was the new owner and asked if Jake was the proprietor. Her words were not a question, but a statement of fact. Jake managed to say yes and gave his name. He asked if she wanted something to drink. His hands were shaking slightly as he reached for a glass. She studied him for several long seconds. Then she moved to sit at the bar with fluid grace that no human could match. Ash! She asked for whiskey and specified that she wanted the strongest he had. Jake poured from a bottle that his uncle had marked with 3 skulls. His hands were steadier now. Working with his hands always made him calmer. He slid the glass across to her and watched as she picked it up and drank the entire thing in one smooth motion. She did not wince or cough or even blink. Jake said that the creature on her shoulders was a dragon. He tried to keep his voice normal like he saw dragons every day. The woman set down the glass and looked at him.
She said he was very observant for a human.
Then she introduced herself. Her name was Lyra Silvermoon, and she was a knight commander of something called the Thornwood Fleet. The small dragon was named Ember, and he was apparently an heir to something called the Crimson Throne. The dragon made a small, chirping sound that somehow conveyed smugness. Jake poured himself a drink, because this seemed like a situation that required one. He asked why she was here at his bar in the middle of nowhere. For the first time, Lyra's expression changed. Something flickered across her face that might have been fear or grief or exhaustion. She said she had nowhere else to go. She said the Dragon King had come. She said the war she had spent 3 centuries trying to prevent had finally begun. Jake stared at her. 3 centuries. This woman was over 300 years old. The small dragon on her shoulder was royalty. It was a war happening that involved Dragon Kings. His nice, quiet retirement plan was getting complicated very fast. He poured Lyra another drink, and one for himself. He told her to start from the beginning and explain everything. If she was going to hide in his bar, he needed to know what he was hiding her from. Lyra looked at him for a long moment, then she began to speak. She told him about the dragons. They were not animals, but an ancient race, older than most civilizations. They could take many forms and cross between dimensions. They were powerful and dangerous, and most of them wanted nothing to do with the younger races that filled the galaxy. But one dragon wanted more. His name was Azeroth, and he called himself the Dragon King. 10,000 years ago, Azeroth had tried to unite all dragons under his rule. He wanted to conquer and consume entire worlds. The elves and other elder races had fought him. The war had nearly destroyed half the known galaxy. Finally, the first elders had managed to trap him in a prison between dimensions. They thought he would stay there forever. Someone had let him out. Now Azeroth was free and he was hunting. Wanted to find every dragon who might challenge his power and destroy them. He especially wanted the young ones like Ember, who carried royal bloodlines. If he killed them, he would cement his rule forever. Ember's mother had been a guardian. She protected entire star systems. When Azeroth came for her, she had sent Ember away to Lyra. Then she had fought and died, buying time for her son to escape. Azeroth had destroyed her world just to prove a point. No one could stand against him. Lyra had been running for 6 months. She had hidden Ember on 17 different worlds. Azeroth kept finding them. His fleet was vast and his spies were everywhere. She was tired and running out of places to hide. When she found this forgotten station and this forgotten bar, she decided to stop running. If Azeroth found them here, she would make her final stand. Jake listened to all of this while drinking his whiskey. When Lyra finished talking, he poured them both another round. Then he said this was the strangest first week of bar ownership anyone had ever had. Lyra almost smiled. It was tiny, but it was there. Jake looked at Ember, who was watching him with eyes too intelligent for something so small. He asked the dragon if he was okay. Ember made a soft sound that was clearly sad. Jake reached out slowly and scratched the dragon under his chin.
Ember
Leaned into the touch and made a small rumbling sound like a purr. Lyra watched this with surprise on her face. She said Ember did not usually trust people that quickly. Jake shrugged and said he was good with broken things. Maybe dragons were not that different from engines. They both needed someone to care about them. He told Lyra she could stay as long as she needed. The bar had rooms upstairs that were dusty but functional. If the Dragon King came looking, then they would deal with it together. He was just a mechanic, but his uncle had not left him just a bar. There were things in the basement, strange tools and weapons and devices Jake did not fully understand yet. Maybe some of them would be useful. Lyra stared at him like he was insane. She asked why he would risk his life for strangers. Jake thought about it while pouring another round. Then he said that maybe he was tired of only fixing machines. Maybe it was time to try fixing something bigger. The station hummed around them. Outside, the war was spreading. But inside the rusty comet, there was whiskey and company and the beginning of something that might have been hope. 3 days passed, and Jake learned many things about living with an elf warrior and a dragon prince. Lyra did not sleep much, and when she did, it was sitting up with her sword across her lap. Ember was growing at a rate that seemed impossible. On the first day, he was the size of a house cat. By the third day, he was as big as a medium dog. He also had developed a taste for the synthetic meat sticks that Jake bought from the noodle stand next door. The bar stayed empty during those 3 days. No customers came by. Jake used the time to keep fixing things, and Lyra used the time to study star charts. She pulled up holographic displays on every available surface. Red marks covered dozens of systems showing where Azeroth's fleet had struck. The pattern was spreading like a disease. Jake brought her coffee and food when she forgot to eat. He asked questions about the war and the dragons, and the politics of species he had never heard of. Lyra answered in her careful, precise way. She had been fighting for so long that war was just her normal state of being. Jake found that incredibly sad. Ember followed Jake around the bar like a puppy. The dragon watched him work with curious eyes. When Jake fixed a broken table leg, Ember chirped with what seemed like approval. When Jake dropped a wrench, Ember picked it up in his teeth and brought it back. They developed an easy partnership. On the morning of the 4th day, the station, it was not the normal vibration of the gravity generators or the life support systems. This was different. The whole structure groaned like something massive had just appeared nearby. Alarms started blaring throughout the station. Jake ran to his ancient security console and brought up the external sensors. 3 ships had just dropped out of hyperspace, right next to the station. They were not normal ships. These were warships of a scale Jake had only seen in military documentaries. Each one was the size of a small city. Their hulls were covered in weapons that could crack planets. The sensor readings showed energy signatures that made no sense. These ships should not be able to exist with that much power contained in metal. Jake's console beeped with an incoming transmission. Someone was hailing them specifically. Not the station. Not the bar district. Just the rusty comet. Just him. Lyra was already moving. Her armor flowed across her body like it was alive. The sword at her side began to glow with cold blue light. She looked at Jake, and her expression was calm, but her eyes showed fear. She said Azeroth had found them. Jake's hand hovered over the accept button for the transmission. He looked at Ember, who had grown tense and was showing teeth Jake had not known he had. He looked at Lyra, who stood ready to fight impossible odds. Then he pressed the button. The main screen flickered to life, and Jake forgot how to breathe. The being on the screen was huge. Even through the video feed, Jake could tell this thing was at least 12 feet tall. He had the basic shape of a humanoid, but everything else was wrong. Horns curved back from his skull like a crown. His skin was covered in scales so fine they looked like metal. His eyes burned with actual fire that seemed to consume light around them. When he smiled, Jake saw teeth designed for ripping through starship holes. The dragon. King looked at the camera, and his gaze felt physical. Jake had the sensation of being weighed and measured by something so far beyond human that comparison was meaningless. Then those burning eyes shifted to look at Lyra. Azeroth spoke, and his voice made the station shake. He called Lyra Little Silver Moon like she was a child. He asked if she was still playing nursemaid to children. He said if she gave him the whelp, he would let her pet human live. His tone made it clear he thought this was generous. Lyra stepped forward, and her voice was cold as winter on a dead world. She said he would have to come through her. She called him tyrant with the kind of contempt that could start wars. Azeroth laughed, and the sound made the hull plates rattle. He said he had killed elder gods. He said Lyra was barely worth remembering. He gave them 1 hour to bring Ember to him. If they did not comply, he would crack the station open like an egg and take what he wanted from the wreckage. Then the screen went dark. Silence filled the bar. Jake could hear his own heartbeat. He could hear Ember breathing fast with fear. He could hear Lyra's armor humming with contained energy as she prepared for battle she knew she could not win. Then, Jake said he had a really stupid idea. Lyra turned to look at him. Her expression suggested she thought he had lost his mind. She asked what kind of idea could possibly help against a dragon god who had been killing things since before. Human civilization existed. Jake walked behind the bar and started pulling out bottles. These were from his uncle's special collection. the bottles that had been gathering dust in the back. Some had labels in languages that no longer existed. Some glowed faintly with their own light. One seemed to contain a miniature storm. Jake had been afraid to touch most of them. He held up the bottle with the storm inside. He said this was Voy whiskey. His uncle had gotten it from a trader who claimed it was brewed in the space between dimensions. Jake had seen his uncle serve it once to a Krellian warlord. The warlord had been clinically dead for 10 minutes before they revived him. Lyra stared at him. She asked if he was seriously suggesting they challenge a 10,000-year-old dragon god to a drinking contest. Jake said yes. He explained his reasoning. He was a mechanic, not a warrior. He knew how machines worked, and he knew how biology worked. He knew what alcohol did to systems. Dragons might be powerful and ancient, but they still had biology. They still had chemistry happening in their bodies. Strong enough alcohol could affect anything that lived. But the real trick was psychology. Dragons were arrogant. Azeroth was the king of arrogant dragons. He would not be able to resist proving his superiority in every possible way. If a mere human challenged him, he would accept just to demonstrate how far beneath whom humans were. They would make it a stakes game. If Jake won, then Azeroth had to leave and never come back. If Azeroth won, then Lyra would hand over Ember voluntarily. The Dragon King would get what he wanted without having to crack open the station and kill everyone inside, Lyra said. Absolutely not. She would never agree to gamble Ember's life on something so insane. Her voice was hard, and her hand was on her sword. Then Ember spoke for the first time since Jake had met him. His voice was small and high, but clear. He said it was brilliant. He said the Ancient Ones were always trapped by their pride. His father had told him stories about how the oldest dragons were, prisoners of their own arrogance. Lyra looked at Ember with shock. The little dragon looked back at her with determination in his eyes. He said if they did nothing, they all died. If they tried this insane plan, they might live. It was better odds than fighting Jake. Watched Lyra struggle with the decision. She had spent 3 centuries protecting dragons. She had fought in wars that spanned galaxies. She had survived things that would destroy normal people. But asking her to gamble with Ember's life was asking her to go against everything she was. Finally, she closed her eyes and took a deep breath. When she opened them again, she looked older and more tired than Jake had ever seen her. She said if this failed, they all died. She said it in a way that meant she had already accepted that outcome. Jake said if they did nothing, they all died anyway. At least this way, they got to try something unexpected. He opened a channel to Azeroth's flagship. When the Dragon King appeared on screen again, his expression was amused. He asked what the insects wanted now. Did they wish to beg for mercy? Jake said he wanted to challenge Azeroth to a drinking contest. He said it in the most disrespectful way he could manage. He implied that maybe the great Dragon King was afraid of a simple human and some bottles of alcohol. The silence that followed was deafening. Azeroth stared at Jake through the screen. His burning eyes grew hotter. For a moment, Jake thought he had made a fatal mistake and the Dragon King was going to destroy them all immediately. Then Azeroth laughed. It was a real laugh full of genuine amusement. He said a human was challenging him. He said this would be delightful. He accepted. He told the little mechanic to prepare his coffin because he would need it soon. The screen went dark again. Lyra looked at Jake like she could not decide if he was the bravest person she had ever met or the stupidest. Jake said it could be both. He went back to preparing the bottles. His hands were steady, even though his mind was screaming at him. He had just challenged a god to a drinking contest. This was either going to work, or they were all going to die in the next hour. Ember walked over and pressed his head against Jake's leg. The dragon was warm, and Jake could feel him trembling slightly. Jake scratched behind Ember's horns and told him it would be okay. He was not sure if he believed it, but saying it out loud helped. Outside the bar, the station held its breath. Azeroth was coming. Jake set up 6 bottles in a careful line on the bar. Each one was more dangerous than the last. He arranged them by color because he did not trust most of the labels. Some were written in languages that hurt to look at. Others had warnings that seemed to shift and change when he was not looking directly at them. His uncle had collected alcohol from across the galaxy. Apparently some of it came from places that should not exist. Lyra stood near the door, with her hand on her sword. She had not put away her armor. Jake understood why. If this went wrong, she would have seconds to act before Azeroth killed them all. Ember was hiding under a table in the corner. The young dragon was trying to look brave, but his scales kept shifting to colors that showed fear. The door opened without anyone touching it. The temperature in the bar rose 10 degrees instantly. Azeroth had to duck to fit through the entrance, and even then, his horns scraped the ceiling. Up close, he was even more terrifying than he had been on the screen. His presence filled the space like a physical weight. Jake felt pressure behind his eyes and in his chest. Just being near this thing was dangerous. Azeroth looked around the bar with amusement on his massive face. He said the place was quaint. The word dripped with contempt. He moved to the reinforced chair that Jake had prepared. The chair groaned under his weight but held. The Dragon King settled himself and looked at Jake with burning eyes that showed no mercy. He asked if Jake was ready to begin this farce. His tone suggested he expected this to be over in seconds. Jake forced himself to meet those terrible eyes. He explained the rules. 6 rounds. They both drank the same thing each round. Last one, conscious one. Simple and clean. Azeroth asked what happened if Jake died during the process. The question was casual, like he was asking about the weather. Jake said then he died. Stakes were stakes. He tried to sound more confident than he felt. Something changed in Azeroth's expression. It was tiny, but Jake saw it. Curiosity, maybe. Or possibly the faintest hint of respect. The Dragon King said very well. He told Jake to begin. Jake picked up the first bottle. This was Martian firewater. It was red and thick and smelled like burning copper. Jake poured 2 glasses and pushed one toward Azeroth. Then he picked up his own glass and waited. Azeroth picked up his glass between 2 massive fingers. The glass looked like a toy in his hand. He drank it in one motion and set the glass down. He did not blink or react in any way. He looked at Jake with expectation. Jake drank his own glass. The liquid went down like molten metal. His throat burned and his eyes watered. His stomach tried to reject what he had just put in it. He forced himself to keep a neutral expression and set down his glass without. Coughing, Azeroth made a sound that might have been approval. The second bottle was Centauri gin. It was clear, but had tiny particles floating in it that seemed to move against the current when Jake poured. The label claimed it contained exotic matter from the edge of a black hole. Jake had no idea if that was true, but his uncle had written on the bottle to never drink more than 1 glass. They both drank. Azeroth paused after swallowing. His burning eyes flickered slightly. He looked at Jake with more interest than before. Jake felt like his molecules were trying to remember they were supposed to be solid. Reality seemed slightly negotiable for a few seconds. He gripped the edge of the bar and waited for the sensation to pass. The third bottle had no label at all. The liquid inside was pure black and seemed to absorb light. Jake's uncle had simply written a skull and crossbones on the side. Jake poured carefully because he did not want to spill any of this on his skin. They both drank. Azeroth's expression flickered. For the first time since entering the bar, he looked like something had affected him. His scales rippled with colors that Jake did not have names for. Jake's vision split into 3 overlapping versions of reality. He could see the bar as it was. He could see the bar as it had been when his uncle ran it. He could see the bar as it would be in some possible future. All 3 versions existed at the same time. He held onto the bar with both hands and tried to focus on the present. Azeroth spoke, and his voice came from several seconds in the past. He said Jake was doing better than expected. Most beings were unconscious by now. He asked what Jake was called. He said this with the tone of someone learning the name of an interesting insect. Jake managed to say his name. His voice sounded strange in his own ears, like it was echoing through dimensions. Roth asked why Jake protected the whelp. Ember was nothing to him. The dragon was an inconvenience and a danger. Why risk everything for a creature that was not even his species? Jake took a moment to gather his thoughts. The blackness was still affecting him, and words were difficult. He said he had spent 25 years fixing ships. He had learned that nothing was really broken until you stopped trying to fix it. Ember had lost his mother. The young dragon was scared and alone. Maybe Jake could not fight ancient evils. Maybe he could not save the galaxy. But he could give one scared kid a safe place. That had to count for something. Azia Roth studied him for a long moment. Something in those burning eyes shifted. He said nothing but reached for the fourth bottle. This was the Voight whiskey. The bottle with the miniature storm inside. Jake had saved it for this round because he thought it would be the turning point. He poured carefully. The liquid moved like it was alive. The storm inside swirled faster. They both drank. Reality inverted. Jake was falling through infinite space. He was standing still. He was everywhere and nowhere. Time moved backward and forward simultaneously. He saw the birth of stars and the death of galaxies. He saw Azeroth as he had been 10,000 years ago before imprisonment and madness. He saw himself from the outside and did not recognize the person. When reality reasserted itself, Jake was on his back on the floor. The ceiling tiles were forming patterns that looked like constellations. He could not remember falling. He could not remember his own name for a moment. Azeroth was still sitting, but his eyes had dimmed. The burning light was still there, but it was lower. He was breathing heavily. His scales had lost some of their metallic sheen. The Dragon King spoke slowly like words were difficult. He said Jake had heart. He said this was unusual. Most species lost that quality when they reached the stars. Power and technology burned away the simple kindness that made life worth living. Jake tried to speak, but could only make a sound. He tried again. He asked if Azeroth was going to finish. The words came out slurred but understandable. Azeroth smiled. It was not a kind smile, but it was genuine. He said, of course. Stakes were stakes. He reached for the fifth bottle with a hand that shook slightly. The fifth bottle had only a skull symbol drawn on it. No words, no warnings. Just a skull. Jake's uncle had written underneath it in shaky handwriting that this bottle should never be opened except in the most dire circumstances. These. It seemed like dire circumstances Jake could not remember. Standing up, but he was behind the bar again. His body moved on autopilot. He poured 2 glasses of liquid that seemed to exist in more dimensions than normal reality allowed. The stuff looked like liquid starlight mixed with concentrated darkness. They both drank. Jake did not remember anything after that. When he woke up, he was on the floor again. Ember's concerned face was inches from his own. The young dragon was making worried sounds. Jake tried to sit up and the room spun violently. He lay back down and stared at the ceiling. He heard Lyra's voice tight with tension. She said both of them had passed out simultaneously. She had been preparing to die. But Azeroth was laughing. Jake turned his head carefully. The Dragon King was slumped in his chair with his massive head tilted back. A deep rumbling sound was coming from him. His eyes were open but barely glowing. He was laughing. It was a real laugh, full of something that might have been joy. Azeroth spoke without moving. His voice was rough and tired. He said Jake had not challenged him to win. The human had challenged him to connect. To remember what it was like when he had been young and foolish enough to drink with friends. When the galaxy was new and full of wonder instead of things to conquer. The Dragon King sat up slowly. The station groaned with the movement. He looked at Jake with eyes that were still burning but somehow different. Clearer, maybe. Or sadder. He said Jake was either the bravest human he had met or the stupidest. Possibly both. Then he turned to look at Ember, who was still pressed against Jake. Protectively, Azeroth told the young dragon that he had found a strange protector. This human had earned Ember time. Time to grow strong enough that when they finally fought, it would be worthy of songs. Azeroth would return, but not today. Not until Ember was ready. Lyra stepped forward with her sword half drawn. She demanded to know why. Why spare any of them? She had been prepared to die fighting. This mercy made no sense. Azeroth stood, and the ceiling cracked from his horns touching it. He said the human had reminded him of something he had forgotten. That strength without connection was merely violence. That power without purpose was just destruction. The whelp needed time to grow. Azeroth also needed time. Time to remember why he had once cared about such things. Time to decide if he wanted to be a king or just a monster. He moved toward the door. Each step made the floor tremble. At the threshold, he paused and looked back at Jake, who was trying to sit up with Ember's help. Jake spent 2 days recovering from the drinking contest. His body felt like it had been taken apart and put back together wrong. Every cell ached with a pain that normal medicine could not touch. Lyra told him he was lucky to be alive. Most beings who drank even half of what he had consumed would be dead or permanently damaged. Humans were apparently more resilient than they looked. Ember stayed close to Jake during the recovery. The young dragon brought him water and food. He curled up next to Jake's bed at night, radiating warmth. The experience had created a bond between them. Jake had risked everything for a creature he barely knew. Ember would not forget that. On the 3rd day, Jake felt well enough to go back downstairs. The bar needed work after Azeroth's visit. The Dragon King's presence had warped some of the metal fixtures. The floor was cracked where he had walked, but the structure was sound and Jake could fix cosmetic damage easily. What he could not fix was what happened next. People started showing up. The first arrival was a trader named Sam, who ran a cargo hauler between stations. He came in looking nervous and asked if this was the place where a human had outdrunk the Dragon King. Word had spread somehow. People talked. Stories traveled faster than ships in some cases. Jake confirmed it was true while pouring Sam a beer. The trader stared at him like he was looking at a legend. Sam asked if the Dragon King had really laughed. If Azeroth had really shown mercy, Jake said yes to both questions. Sam bought 3 more beers and sat in silence for an hour. Before leaving, he told Jake that people were calling the Rusty Comet neutral ground now, a place where even enemies could drink in peace. Jake was not sure how he felt about that. More people came. A Zentari scout, a human merchant, a Vrax enforcer who was wanted in 6 systems. They all came to see the bar and the man who had challenged a god. Most of them bought drinks and left. Some stayed longer. All of them treated the place with a strange kind of reverence. Lyra watched this with growing concern. She told Jake that attention was dangerous. The more people who knew about them, the more likely Azeroth's enemies would come looking. Or worse, his allies might decide to test if the Dragon King's mercy extended to others. Jake understood her worry, but he also saw an opportunity. People who came to the bar were people who needed a safe place. The galaxy was full of violence and war and endless conflict. Maybe his bar could be a small island of peace. Maybe that was worth the risk. He hired help. The first was a Zentari woman named Lynn. She had been working at the noodle stand next door and was grateful for a job that paid better. She was fast and efficient and had a gift for reading customers. She knew when someone wanted to talk and when they wanted to be left alone. The second hire was a human woman named Kate Murphy. She had been a soldier in one of the corporate wars. She had scars on her arms and a look in her eyes that said she had seen things she wished she could forget. Jake hired her as security. Kate was quiet and professional. She also had an arsenal of weapons hidden in places throughout the bar. Jake decided not to ask where she got them. With help, Jake could focus on what he did best. He fixed things. He upgraded the air system. He reinforced the structure. He installed better sensors and a communication array that could reach across the sector. The bar slowly transformed from a dive into something better. Ember was growing fast. By the end of the first week, after Azeroth's visit, he was the size of a large pony. His scales had darkened to deep crimson with gold highlights. His eyes glowed with intelligence that sometimes frightened Jake. This was not a pet. This was an ancient being in a young body learning what it meant to have power. The young dragon took 2 greeting customers at the door. His presence became part of the bar's identity. People would come in, and Ember would rumble at them in greeting. His scales would shift colors based on his mood. Gold meant he was happy. Blue meant he was cautious. Red meant danger, and Kate would casually move closer with her hand near a weapon. Lyra remained vigilant. She spent her days monitoring communications and tracking fleet movements. The war was spreading. Azeroth was still hunting dragons who resisted his rule. His forces had taken control of 12 systems. Refugee ships were fleeing in all directions. The major powers were trying to decide if this was their problem or if they should let the dragons sort it out themselves. But something had changed. Azeroth's fleet was moving more slowly now. They were consolidating territory instead of just destroying everything. Some of his commanders had started negotiating with local governments instead of simply crushing them. Lyra said this was unusual. The Dragon King, she remembered, would never show such restraint. Jake wondered if their drinking, his contest, had actually changed something. He did not voice this thought because it seemed arrogant to think he could influence a being that old and powerful. But the timing was suspicious. More unusual visitors started arriving. A captain from Azeroth's fleet came alone and unarmed. She was a dragon in humanoid form with scales that shifted between green and blue. She sat at the bar and ordered wine. She told Jake that her king spoke of him. Azeroth had shared the story of their contest with his inner circle. Some of them were curious about the human who had shown such courage or stupidity. The captain drank her wine and watched, Ember playing with a piece of metal that Jake had given him. She told them her name was Commander Vera Stone. She said she remembered when Azeroth had been different. Before his imprisonment, he had been a leader, not a tyrant. The centuries in the void had changed him, made him harder and more cruel. But lately she had seen hints of the old Azeroth, the one who actually cared about his people. She finished her wine and left without another word. Kate watched her go with suspicion, but the visit was peaceful. Other dragons came. Some were refugees fleeing Azeroth's forces. They came seeking sanctuary, and Jake gave it to them. The bar became a waypoint for dragons who needed rest. They would arrive exhausted and afraid. They would drink and eat and sleep in the rooms upstairs. Then they would leave stronger and with information about safe routes from Lyra's networks. Not everyone approved. A bounty hunter named Dale Cross came looking for a dragon who had a price on her head. The dragon was a young female named Ruby, who had stolen supplies from one of Azeroth's outposts. She was hiding upstairs when Dale kicked in the door demanding. Jake handed her over. Kate broke Dale's arm before he finished his sentence. She threw him out onto the station corridor and told him the bar was neutral ground. Anyone who violated that would answer to her. Dale left making threats, but he did not come back. Word spread further. The Rusty Comet was becoming known across multiple sectors. Smugglers and traders and refugees all knew about the bar where a mechanic had challenged the Dragon King and lived. Some called it legend. Others called it sanctuary. Jake just called it home, but with fame came danger. Not everyone respected neutral ground. Not everyone believed in safe places. There were those who saw the bar as a target or a challenge. Those who wanted to prove they were stronger than the human who had faced down a god. Lyra warned Jake that violence was coming. She could read the patterns in how people moved and talked. Someone would eventually try to take what they had built, either for glory or for profit or just because they could. Jake cleaned glasses and listened. He knew she was right. He also knew he was not going to run. This bar was his now. These people who came seeking safety were his responsibility. Whatever came next, he would face it the same way he faced everything else. With steady hands and stubborn determination, Ember curled around his feet under the bar. The dragon had grown protective of Jake in the bar. His scales glowed with content colors. Outside, the war raged on. Inside the Rusty Comet, there was warmth and light and the sound of people talking. For now, that was enough. But Lyra stood by the window watching the stars. Her hand never left her sword. She knew peace was temporary. She had lived long enough to know that safety was an illusion. Something was coming. She could feel it in the way the station hummed, in the way the stars seemed to hold their breath. The question was not if violence would find them, but when. 2 months passed, and the Rusty Comet became something Jake had never expected. It was more than a bar now. It was a symbol. People from across the sector knew about the place, where species who were supposed to be enemies could sit together and drink in peace. The regulars were an unusual mix. There was Betty Grant, who ran a salvage operation and always ordered the same beer. There was a Thraxi merchant named Korth, who had 3 arms and loved terrible jokes. There was Commander Vera Stone, who came once a week from Azeroth's fleet and always sat in the corner watching everything. There were refugees and traders and soldiers and criminals all sharing the same space. Jake had expanded the menu and the staff. Lynn now managed the day shift. Kate handled security and had trained 2 additional guards. A human cook named Sarah Bell ran the kitchen Jake had built in the back. The upstairs rooms were always full of people passing through. Some stayed a night. Others stayed weeks. All of them respected the rules. The rules were simple. No fighting inside the bar. No weapons drawn except in defense. No hunting anyone who came seeking sanctuary. Anyone who broke the rules answered to Kate. She was not gentle about enforcement. Ember was now the size of a small horse. His scales had become deep crimson, shot through with veins of gold. His wings had started to develop, and he practiced flying in the cargo bay that Jake had rented next door. The young dragon had become the unofficial mascot of the bar. Children who came with their parents would ask to pet him. Ember was always gentle with the small ones. Lyra remained watchful, but even she had started to relax slightly. The war continued, but its nature had changed. Azeroth was still consolidating power, but he was negotiating more and destroying less. Some systems had joined his alliance willingly. Others had made deals for autonomy. The Dragon King was building an empire. But it was becoming less about conquest and more about unity. This confused the major powers. The human governments and the Zentari collectives and the other species councils did not know how to respond to a Dragon King who actually kept his word. They had been preparing for total war. Instead, they were facing something more complex. Lyra spent her evenings reviewing intelligence reports and trying to understand what had changed. She told Jake that Azeroth's inner circle was different now. He had promoted commanders who valued strategy over brutality. He had started rebuilding worlds his forces had damaged. This was not the behavior of the tyrant, she remembered. Jake listened while cleaning glasses. He did not pretend to understand galactic politics. He was just a mechanic who ran a bar. But he had noticed something in Azeroth's eyes during their drinking contest. Loneliness. The Dragon King had been alone for so long that he had forgotten what connection felt like. Maybe reminding him had changed something fundamental. It was a quiet evening when the door opened, and a figure entered that made everyone in the bar go silent. He was tall and wore robes that seemed to be made of shadow. His face was hidden behind a mask of silver metal. He moved with fluid grace that suggested incredible power held carefully in check. Kate's hand went to her weapon. Lynn stepped back behind the bar. The regulars all found reasons to look at their drinks instead of the newcomer. Only Lyra stood to face him with her hand on her sword. The figure spoke with a voice like wind through empty halls. He asked if this was the Rusty Comet. He asked if Jake Morrison was present. Jake stepped forward from behind the bar. He said he was Jake and asked what the visitor wanted. He kept his voice steady despite the fear crawling up his spine. The masked figure studied him for a long moment. Then he reached up and removed his mask. Beneath it was a face that was beautiful and terrible. Eyes like galaxies. Skin that seemed to shimmer between existence and non-existence. This was no normal being. This was something ancient and powerful. He introduced himself as Keeper Darius. He said he was one of the first elders, the ones who had imprisoned Azeroth 10,000 years ago. He had come because he had heard interesting stories about a human in a bar and a drinking contest that had changed the course of a war. Jake offered him a drink. It was the only thing he could think to do. Keeper Darius smiled and accepted. He sat at the bar and waited while Jake poured whiskey with hands that only shook slightly. The Keeper drank and made a sound of appreciation. Then he told them why he had come. The first elders had been watching Azeroth since his release. They had been preparing to imprison him again when something unexpected happened. The Dragon King had started to change, to show restraint and wisdom instead of just rage and hunger. The elders wanted to know why. Their investigation had led them here. To a bar on a forgotten station, to a mechanic who had done something impossible. Jake had reached a being they had thought was beyond reaching. He had reminded Azeroth of something the elders themselves had forgotten, that even the oldest and most powerful beings needed connection and purpose. Keeper. Darius said the elders were debating what to do next. Some wanted to still imprison Azeroth. Others wanted to wait and see if this change was genuine. The galaxy was balanced on a knife edge. What happened next would determine if there was war or peace. He asked Jake what he thought. A human mechanic who by all rights should be dead, but instead had become something of a legend. What did he think should happen? Jake took a moment to think. Everyone in the bar was watching him, waiting for his answer. He looked at Ember, who had grown so much. He looked at Lyra, who had spent centuries fighting. He looked at the regulars who had come to trust this place. Then he looked at Keeper Darius. Jake said he thought people deserved second chances. Even dragon gods. Azeroth had been imprisoned for 10,000 years. That was a long time to think about mistakes. Maybe he had learned something. Maybe he could be different now. The galaxy had enough war. Maybe it was time to try something else. Keeper Darius listened without interrupting. When Jake finished, the elder nodded slowly. He said this was wise counsel. He said the elders would consider it. Then he finished his drink and stood to leave. Before going, he told Jake that the Rusty Comet had become important. A neutral place where different species and factions could meet without violence. The elders would ensure it remained protected. No one would be allowed to destroy what Jake had built here. Then he was gone as silently as he had arrived. The bar remained quiet for a long moment. Then someone laughed. Then someone else ordered a drink. Life resumed. Lyra sat down next to Jake at the bar. She said he had just influenced the decisions of beings who shaped galaxies. She said this with a tone that mixed respect and disbelief. Jake poured them both a drink. He said he just told the truth. That was all anyone could do. Ember came over and pressed his large head against Jake's side. The dragon rumbled with contentment. Jake scratched behind his horns in the spot that Ember loved. Outside the station, the war continued, but its shape was changing. Azeroth's forces were reaching out to make alliances instead of just conquering. Some dragons who had fled were returning. Negotiations were happening. It was slow and fragile, but it was something. The Rusty Comet became busier. More people came seeking the neutral ground that the first elders had promised to protect. Kate had to hire more security. Sarah expanded the kitchen. Lynn trained new bartenders. Jake spent his days fixing things and his evenings talking with customers from 100 different worlds. Ember grew larger and stronger. He started to understand his own power. Lyra began training him in combat and diplomacy. The young dragon was learning what it meant to be royalty. What responsibilities came with power? Jake watched him grow with pride. One night, Jake stood on the observation deck above the bar and looked out at the stars. Lyra joined him. They stood in comfortable silence for a while. Lyra said she had never expected this. She had been fighting for 3 centuries. She had forgotten what peace felt like. This bar and this strange family they had built was teaching her. Jake said he had never expected any of it either. He had just wanted a quiet retirement. Instead, he got dragons and elves and ancient gods and wars that spanned galaxies. Lyra almost smiled. She said she was glad Jake's uncle had left him the bar. She was glad Jake had decided to stay. She was glad a simple mechanic had shown more wisdom than warriors and elders. They stood together watching the stars. Below them, the bar was full of life and laughter. Beings from across the galaxy sharing space and stories. It was not perfect. Violence still existed. War still threatened. But here in this small corner of the universe, there was peace. And sometimes that was the most radical act of all. To choose connection over conflict. To offer sanctuary instead of judgment. To believe that even ancient evils could change if someone showed them a better way. Jake did not know what the future held. Azeroth would return someday. There would be a reckoning between the Dragon King and Ember. Wars would come and go. But for now, there was this moment.
This place.
These people. The rusty comet shone like a small star in the darkness. A beacon for those who needed rest. A reminder that sometimes the greatest battles were won not with weapons, but with whiskey and courage, and the simple act of treating others with dignity. Jake finished his drink and went back downstairs. There was work to do. There were always repairs to make, and customers to serve, and problems to solve. That was what he understood. That was what he was good